power number 1, I think, and now we're going to start power number 2 from the book which named Research Methodology, a step-by-step guide for beginners, and we are going to continue this book with the power number 2. Okay. Now today we are going to study about the variables. You know what's the meaning of variables, and you know we have different variables, and we're going to study them. Active variables are those variables that can be manipulated, changed, or controlled. So we name these variables active variables. That you know, in writing proposal, you must define active variables from attribute variables. And attribute variables are those variables that cannot be manipulated, changed, or controlled. So they cannot control, they cannot change, they cannot be manipulated, they cannot be changed, and they cannot be controlled. And the effect of characteristics of the study: population, for example, age, gender. Gender means male or female, education, and income. Listen please, in your book you can see many examples, but we don't have much time for practice in saying these examples in the class. But if you don't understand, you can refer to your book and you can see the examples of each part. Okay, each part has examples, and you can see and read the examples, and you can understand that part of the book, because we are studying very brief in class and we don't have time for practice and talk about examples. So active variables, attribute variables, and categorical variables. Categorical variables are measured on nominal or ordinal measurement scales, whereas for continuous variables, the measurements are made on either an invertal or a ratio. So in categorical variables, you can see a kind of measurement, nominal measurement or ordinal measurement scales, and this type of variable can be divided to different types. 3 types of categorical variables we can observe here. 1 constant variables, only 1 category or value. For example, taxi, tree, and water. So they have only 1 category or value. In number 2 or type 2, dichotomous variable, we have two categories. For example, male and female, yes or no, good and bad, head and tail, up and down, and rich and poor. So we have only two categories. And in number three, polytomous variable can be divided into more than two categories. For example, religion. We have many religions: Christian, Muslim, Hindu. Okay, so these variables are named polytomous variables. Okay, I don't know. There are other students. All of the students are not present in the class. Broaden. Okay, and then we are going to study continuous variables. What are the continuous variables? Continuous variables, on the other hand, have continuity in their measurement. You can understand from its name, continuous variable, continuity in their measurement. For example, age is numeral, or we can measure it, okay? In common attitude score. Score is measurement. We can measure the score. They can take any value on the scale on which they are measured. Age can be measured in years, months, and days. Similarly, income can be measured in dollars. Income, the payments or income that you can receive each month can be measured in dollars and cents. So, continuous variables are variables that we can measure them. And here in this picture. Okay, you can say the types of the variables here. You can see each category. For example, the table number 5.3, categorical, continuous, and quantitative and qualitative variables. You can see here qualitative and quantitative. You have read it before. In this table, you can see categorical, that we talked about that, constant, dichotomous, and polytomous variable. For example, you can see water, tree, taxi, that we have talked about that. We talked here. Okay. Categorical. Type number 2, dichotomous. We talked about that. We have two, only two factor here, yes or no, good and bad, rich and poor, day and night, male and female, and hot and cold. And the type number 3, polytomos, you can see attitude, for example, and uncertain, and go on, and then continuous variables that are separated from categorical. You can measure it, for example, income, age, weight, we talked about that. You can measure them. And then you have qualitative and quantitative that we talked about the previous sections. Qualitative, for example, gender, male or female, educational, for example, level, high, average, low, age, old, young, and child, income, high and middle and low, and go on. And qualitative, for example, educational level, income, how much dollar per year, okay? This is in detail, as you can see here. So you can see qualitative categories and quantitative categories in this table. If you have a question, you can ask. Okay, now we're going to start this power, but okay, from the done, I don't know. You cannot see it completely. I read it from a power for you now. Okay, now I'm going to read it for you. For a beginner, it is important to understand that the way a variable is measured determines the type of analysis. So please notice the way a variable is measured determines the type of analysis that can be performed. The statistical producers that can be applied to the data, the way the data can be interpreted, and the findings that can be communicated. You may not realize in the beginning that the style of your report is entirely dependent upon the way the different variables have been measured. So the type of measuring the variables is related to your analysis. And that is the way question has been asked and its response recorded. The way you measure the variables in your study determines whether the study is a qualitative or quantitative in nature. That we talked about in previous section. I will send it for you. Don't worry. To your group after the class, I will send it for you. Don't be worried. Just at the top is here. I'm going to write it for you here. Just one sentence is not clear at the top. I'm going for you to write it here. And I will send the power for you. Here is at the beginning of this power. For a beginner, you can see here. Here is the two line that is not clear. For a beginner, it is important to understand that the way a variable is measured determines, and after that is clear here, the type of analysis that can be performed. Okay? So this is the top of this, and I will send the powers for you for studying for your exam. Don't be worried. And I just ask the questions in your final exam from your powers. So I will send the powers at the end of the class for you. Okay, now we receive chapter 6. We are going to study brief, the important notes and keys only, not all of the chapter. You can see here, constructing hypothesis, and all of these chapters that you're going to study here, we will study in the last chapter, writing the proposal. And there I will tell you, we studied this, for example, in chapter 6. We studied the description of this part in chapter 8, okay? But each part of the proposal we are going to study here. For example, constructing hypothesis. That is a part of your proposal. We are going to read in this chapter in brief. In this chapter, you will learn about the definition of a hypothesis, the function of a hypothesis in your research, how hypotheses are tested, how to formulate a hypothesis or write a hypothesis, different types of hypotheses and their applications. But we're going to study brief how errors in testing of a hypothesis can occur and the use of hypothesis in qualitative research. But we're not going to study all of these purposes. The definition of a hypothesis. The second important consideration in the formulation of a research problem in quantitative research is the construction of a hypothesis. Hypotheses bring clearly specificity and focus to a research problem, but are not essential for study. So please note, they are not essential, but they can bring clearly and clarity and specificity to your research. There are many definitions of a hypothesis according to Klinger's hypothesis. Kerlinger is the name of the scientist. A hypothesis is a conjectural statement of the relationship between two or more variables. The formulation of a hypothesis provides a study with focus. It tells you what specific aspects of a research problem to investigate, and that is very good for describing the problem in your thesis or in your research. A hypothesis tells you what data to collect and what not to collect, thereby providing focus to the study. So we talked about that it is not necessary, but it is good for us or for everyone that this part located and locate in the research. So as it provides a focus, the construction of a hypothesis enhances objectivity in study. A hypothesis may enable you to add to formulation of a theory if enables you to conclude specifically what is true or what is false. So it can clear the title too. Sorry. Okay, and hypothesis should be simple, specific, and conceptually clear. So, what are the characteristics of a hypothesis? What form the hypothesis must be in the researchers? A hypothesis should be simple, specific, and conceptually clear. A hypothesis should be capable of verification methods. So these purple lines are the characteristics, are the important characteristics of hypothesis. So first of all, it must be simple, specific, and conceptually clear. And number two, a hypothesis should be capable of verification. Methods and techniques must be available for data collection and analysis. So we say this character capable of verification. And number three, the characteristic number three, hypothesis should be related to the existing body of knowledge. It is important that your hypothesis emerges from the existing body of knowledge and that it adds to it. As this is an important function of research. A research design is a plan, okay? Now we're going to study about the research design. That is a plan, structure, and a strategy of investigation, so conceived as to obtain answers to research questions or problems. Now we're going to selecting a study design. Okay. What is the form of study design? In qualitative studies, the distinction between study design and methods of data collection is far less clear. Quantitative study designs have more clarity and distinction between designs and methods of data collection. So, for designing the study and the form of study design, we have to know if our study is qualitative or quantitative that we have studied before. And quantitative studies are more clear than qualitative studies. And the form of the study design is related with the methods for data collection that you are going to study. Okay. Um, Study designs based on the nature of investigation. We have three types of gathering the data or study design. You know them: experimental, non-experimental, and quasi or semi-experimental. If a relationship is studied in the first way, that means experimental, starting from the cause to establish the effects. So, in experimental studies, we are going just first the cause and then we must establish the effects. It is classified as an experimental study. If the second path is followed, just reverse, okay? Starting from the effects to cause, effects to trace the cause, it is classified as a non-experimental study. You can see this picture and you can understand more better, okay? Experimental and non-experimental studies. You can see here the cause. First, we study the cause to explore the cause. For example, treatment, invention of program, treatment invention program, and then you can see at the top experimental studies. We study the effects to explore outcome, impact, or change are the effects. But when we are going, this is experimental studies, but in non-experimental studies, we first of all are going to study the effects, just reverse the effects, and then we are going to find the cause. This is non-experimental studies, okay? If you have any question, please ask me. Okay, if you don't have any question, so we can continue. Okay, and the third kind of the study design here was semi-experimental, if you remember. Semi-experimental. A semi-experimental study or quasi-experimental study has the properties of both experimental and non-experimental studies. Part of the study may be non-experimental and other parts may be experimental. So the semi-experimental study is mixing of these two kinds. And you have the control group design that is very important in your research. In a study, utilizing the control group design, the researcher selects two population groups instead of one. Two groups, a control group and experimental group. So two groups, a control group and experimental group. The experimental group is then exposed to the intervention. So we must have the control group design, and we must have the control group in our studies before the study and after the study. We must compare the control group to our experimental group. What is a sum that the intervention has had an impact on both groups? Any differences in the before and after observations between the groups regarding the dependent variables is attributed to the intervention. So we must first of all, before the observation, before the study, we must focus and study on control group and experimental group. And after the study, the observation is important in control group and experimental group. So we must compare these two groups before and after observation. Okay. The next title is selecting a method for data collection. We have three ways of selecting of data: observation, the interview, and the questionnaire. And these are dependent with the discipline of study. And for example, basic science, for example, mathematics, or biology, or something else, architecture, I don't know, the kinds of the method for data selection is related to the discipline. Some studies needed observation only, for example, biology. Some disciplines need interview and some needs the questionnaires. Major approach to information gathering. We have two major approaches for gathering information and made data: primary data and secondary data. Primary data and secondary data, that in this chart we can see together methods of data collection. You can see here you have two kinds, secondary sources or secondary data and primary sources or primary data. You can see here we are not going to define each of these parts because the book is very complete. Each of these parts has definition, but we are going to study it briefly. Primary sources is contained questionnaire, interviewing, and observation. You can see the primary data is collected, and primary sources is that we read it. Interviewing, observation, and questionnaire. And questionnaire is collective questionnaire. And you can see main questionnaire. Interviewing is divided to structured and unstructured that we are not going to study. Observation is participant and non-participant, and we are not going to study too. And the secondary sources, secondary data related in documents. The documents are secondary data. For example, publishment, earlier research, earlier research, personal records, and go on. So methods of data collection you can see here. And observation is one way to collect primary data. You saw that in the table. Observation is a powerful, systematic, and selective way of watching and listening to an interaction or phenomenon as it takes place. So the observation is one of the ways for collect primary data, and that is very important. There are two types of observation. One, participant observation, and two, non-participant observation that we studied in the table. Participant observation is when you as a researcher participate in the activities of the group being observed in the same manner as its members, with or without their knowing that they are being observed. So we as a researcher participate in activities of the study. But in non-participant observation, on the other hand, is when you as a researcher do not get involved in the activities of the group but remain a passive observer, watching and listening to its activities and drawing conclusions from this. So you are not participant in that observation. We just see and write, and we can watch and listen to activities and then draw, and we get results and conclusions. So we are not as a participant. Okay, the interviewing is a commonly used method of collecting information from people. In many walks of life, we collect information through different forms of interaction with others, and you saw that data was one of the primary sources of collecting data. And the third form is quactionary. In quactionary, you know, you have seen it, many researchers depend on the discipline. Some disciplines needs questionnaires. So a questionnaire is a written list of questions, the answers to which are recorded by respondents. In a questionnaire, respondents read the questions, interpret what is expected, and then write down the answers. So um, one person can ask the questions, and people must answer, and you can write down the answers. The only differences between an interview show and a questionnaire. Please note, this is very important because the interview is very similar to questionnaire, but the difference between that is that in the former, it is the interviewer the interviewer who asks the questions and if necessary explains them and records the respondents' replies on an interview schedule. And in the latter, replies are recorded by the respondents themselves. So this is the differences, because in interview you can record the answers, but in questionnaire they must just answer your questions or they must complete some forms. Okay, some forms of questions they must complete them, and this is the difference between interview and questionnaire. Okay, and then after the collecting data, the next item is selecting the sample. One of the selecting the sample in some disciplines, for example in biology, in macrobiology, that most of you, I think, are macrobiologists, you must select a sample for your data. Okay, so in some disciplines you have to select a sample. You can see the concept of sampling, that the book is very that the book explains it much more, but just you can see that this picture concept of sampling is the study population sampling units. You select a few samples units from the study population. So this is the study population, this is your sample. For example, an environment, soil, water, or etc. So this is your environment, and you pick up one, sample from water or soil, and you collect information from these people to find answers to your research questions. From sample findings, you make an estimate of their prevalence in the study population. Okay. The sampling of collection has three principles. One, in a majority of cases of sampling, there will be a difference between the sample statistics and true population mean, which is attributable to the selection of the units in the sample. So the principal one is that a majority of cases of sampling has some differences between the sample statistics and true population. So they are different from each other. The principle 2 is that the greater the sample size, the more accurate the estimate of the true population means. That means if your sample size is greater, so your accuracy is more, okay? And your study is doing more and more better. So the size of sampling is very important. And the principle 3, the greater the difference in the variable under study in a population for a given sample size, the greater the difference between the sample statistics and the true population mean. Okay, so you can see here this sampling is related with population, and the size of population is very important for sampling. And types of sampling are divided to 3 types: random probability sampling designs, non-random or non-probability sampling designs, selecting a predetermined sample size, and number 3, mixed sampling designs. So we have here 3 kinds of sampling here, and they're explained in the book very completely, but we are not going to teach it. You can study for yourself from the book. Okay, dear students, if you have any question, you can ask me. Okay, we don't have any question. We are going to continue. Step 5, writing a research proposal, or the last chapter of the book, how to write a research proposal. That this is very important for you for writing your proposal. Okay. In research proposal, you must follow some information in your study. So, research proposal should contain the following information about your study. And these items must be in your study. These steps are needed for writing a proposal. An introduction, including a brief literature review, theoretical framework that underpins your study, conceptual framework which constitutes the basis of your study, objectives or research questions of your study. That is very important, and the main part of your proposal is objectives or research questions, and we are going to talk about it in the covers later. And hypothesis to be tested is applicable. We talked about that. It is not very necessary, but it is going to clear more and more the study objectives. Study design that we are proposing to adopt, that we studied, and we talk about study design. Setting for your study, research instruments you are planning to use, and that is for sampling and data collected needed, sampling design and sample size, ethical issue involved, and should you propose to deal with them if it is necessary, data processing procedures, proposed chapters of the report. Chapters are introduction and objectives, problems and limitations of the study, proposed time frame for the project. So the proposal are content of all of these parts. And the first part is preamble or introduction. You're going to study introduction. The proposal should start with an introduction to include some of the information listed below. In writing this section, the literature review is of central importance as it serves two main functions. One, it acquaints you with the available literature in the area of your study, thereby broadening your knowledge base. Two, it provides you with information on the methods and procedures other people have used in similar situations and tells you what works and what does not. So we have two main functions here. One, the available literature area, and another, methods and procedures that other people have used in similar situations. So we can use these two main functions in our introduction and explaining that. The next part, as I told you, is objective of the study, and the hypothesis. Here, before that, we have objectives. Okay. Objective of the study is the most important part of your proposal. In this section include a statement of both your study's main and sub-objective. So you have objective and sub-objectives. Your main objective indicates the central thrust of your study, whereas the sub-objectives identify the specific issues you propose to examine. The objectives of the study should be clearly stated and specific in nature. So the clearly of your objective is very important. It must be very clear, clarify, and indicate the thrust of our study. And the sub-objectives identify the specific issues that we are going to examine. Okay. Please ask your questions if you have any questions. Come on, Mr. Hayda Hassan Mahawi. We cannot study briefer and easier than these powers. You can see your book and you can see my powers. The powers are very, very briefly of your book, and you're not going to study all of that. We cannot small or brief more than this. You can compare the powers in your book and you can understand it. Okay, each sub-objective should delimit only one issue. Use action-oriented verbs such as to determine. You must use these verbs, okay, for explaining the sub-objectives. You must use these verbs such as to determine, to find out, or to ascertain. in formulating of sub-objectives. So for writing of sub-objectives, you must use these verbs to determine, to ascertain, and to find out. And in formulating sub-objectives, which should be numerically listed. In qualitative studies, the statement of objectives is not as precise as quantitative studies. So in qualitative and quantitative, the statements of objectives are a little different. In qualitative studies, is a little less precise and clear than quantitative studies. And in qualitative studies, you should simply mention an overall objective of the study, as your aim is to explore as much as possible as you like. So, in qualitative studies, we must overall objective of the study, and that's very important for qualitative studies. Okay. As I told you in your book, you can see many examples. Each part has many examples that you're not going, we don't have any time for explaining that in the class, but if you don't understand the meaning or explanation of one part, you can refer to your book and you can see the examples that are very, very useful for understanding of you, and you can get the meaning very better. For example, I put one example only here. Example A, for writing the objective to ascertain the impact of immigration on the family. So, this is your objective. For example, this is our objective to ascertain the impact of immigration on the family. And the sub-objectives are contained: 1. To determine the impact of immigration on husband-wife roles as perceived. 2. To find out the impact of immigration on marital relations. 3. To ascertain perceived changes in parental expectations of children's academic, professional achievement. And number 4, to determine perceived changes of attitude towards marriage in the study population. So, this is, for example, example number A for study. You can see many examples, number B, C, D, and etc. And you can get the meaning and understand the meaning way better. Okay, and I will continue the teaching for the next section. Your teaching is enough today, but The next section is the last section, and we have to finish this part of the book, writing the proposal. That is very important. So please read the powers, and I will send it for you. And please, Miss Adnan, remember me for sending these powers. And if you have any question, you can ask the next section. And the duration of your term for this, for this class, I mean, research methods was shorter than the other classes because you get it more later than the other classes, so the conceptions and explanations and the texts are not really large, and we must read it. Thank you. If you don't have any question, I will say goodbye to you. I hope a nice day for you. Take care of yourself and goodbye.